Hi everybody, welcome to the CG Cup Masterclass with Evan Melamundsen. My name is Spiridon Giannakis, and today I will be your host. Hi Evan.
Hello, Mr. Giannakis. It's good to be with you today.
How is it going? All good?
It's good. It's gone good, you know, end of the week, teaching some stuff, trying to convince people that we know what we're talking about. Oh,
yeah.
It's all in the day's work, as they say. yeah, exactly.
So in this masterclass, you learn about character design mostly, but also about how to gather references and how to break down characters, how to apply studies, and about technique in general. And I think best would be if Evan would explain to you guys what he's going to tell you, what you're going to learn.
That was pretty succinctly put, actually. No intention of sounding surprised. It's basically that. It's the importance of contextuality to elevate and make available concept to an audience, and kind of little do's and don'ts, and or more like, you know, I am an old man in the industry. Here are my ideas for what is good. That sort of thing.
Okay. But after this class is finished, like what skills will people have? Which things will they be able to do better than before?
Hopefully think about drawing. I find like one of the big issues that I've been having, and that a lot of my mentees and students have been having, is this idea of like sitting down to draw and then starting the process from there. And the kind of the big sort of holdover in this talk is to kind of promote this idea that the act of drawing is not the entire activity, and that sitting down to solve an ongoing problem is a lot easier than sitting down to figure out what problem to solve.
Let's find out how you got to this knowledge. Tell us a bit about yourself. Like, what made you you? That's
a classic question, and I always have like the worst. I have the worst answer for that, because everyone has these like amazing sort of odysseial, answers of like, I came from the turd mines of Appalachia, and I had to fight my way through art school, shit like that. And my story is incredibly boring. I came from like the suburbs of Oslo, and I was kind of motivated to draw, and I had very supportive parents, and I went to art school, and then I tried to go to art university, and then I found out that art university wasn't really what I wanted, and then I managed to scrape a job with a Canadian studio, and then I moved there, and then I got kind of into the industry, and then I've been moving around and working for a bunch of industry studios and things. Then I kind of went home again once I kind of had established a reliable freelance practice, and there's some personal projects and sort of stuff mixed in there, but this is ostensibly the way that I got started. So in Norway, we have a educational system that kind of it emphasizes choice really vividly. So when you're like 14, 15, you're essentially asked to like start making a basic choice. Like, do you want to go in general studies? Do you want to go in creative studies? Do you want to go in handiwork studies? There's a bunch of different things you can do.
So it's for orientation in general, or?
Yeah, but it's non-sticking. Like you can move on whenever you want. So my plan was, or my kind of go-to was like I took the expressive arts sort of direction when I was 15, and I stuck with that through high school, and then after high school I got into a arts and crafts sort of further school in Oslo, and then through that I got into the university in England, and at no point did I have to kind of look myself in the eye and go like, this is my path. And I feel like that's kind of the come to Jesus moment that a lot of people point to, and like I'm sorry, my life is not that exciting. So essentially, I haven't had to make that choice yet, but I'll let you know when it comes up. But essentially, it's a path I've been kind of traveling along and pushing along it as long as the resistance doesn't get too high. I can keep going. And I mean, I don't want to play down like the importance of art in my life or anything. It is what I do. It is how I define most of my personality. But mine is not a tale of drama and commitment. Mine is a tale of, hey, drawing is pretty neat and I like stories, so let's do that. Yeah.
So what to which clients did that get you, like this preference?
Yeah, so first, well, what it allowed me to do was I've never had to be dogmatic about art. I mean, everyone's been an art student at some point and been like, oh man, I know what true art is. But for the most part, I never had to be dogmatic, and so I've been pretty pragmatic about my approach to art and how I think about, solving visual problems. And the fact that I'm the child of two engineers has made me kind of systematic in my approach. So part of the strength of that is that it was applicable to a lot of clients. I got to go to Volta first, which is in Canada. It's the first studio that hired me. Before that, actually, I had worked freelance for a couple of studios, one of them being a tiny little outfit in Texas. And then later, I got to go work for... I've worked on and off for Blizzard and for Character and a bunch of other studios sort of around. You can see some of them on the screen here. Character, Wizards of the Coast, Blizzard, Axis Animation, Guerrilla Games. And I've gotten most of that work because of structure, because of I can go in and analyze a problem and give them an idea for a solution, and if the idea kind of gets them going, then usually they're into what I produce at the end. So it's that clear-cut concept approach that works really well. My stuff isn't always as visually kind of stunning as a lot of concept art, but I tend to like to emphasize concept over visual stimuli.
I mean, I'm not here to disagree with you, but I think the reason why this appeals at the same time on an almost Splash-like level is because you always manage to tell a story with your art. Because this is part of the believability of the character, isn't it?
That is kind of the approach, indeed.
So you would say this is what you are called for. You're like the guy that is called from these people to create a believable character and to chisel out the structure that basically will be worked on more by everybody else who follows. Is that correct?
Yeah. Early pre-production is kind of my go-to game. And that's the most fun part anyway, because that's when you can play a lot of what-if games and just go what if we did this thing? And then you draw something crazy. It's fun!
So these kind of puzzles is actually why you love what you do. Yeah.
I mean, context building. So bringing back to that first slide, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. The reason why I love that quote is it speaks to the fact that you have to understand the underlying building blocks of something to design it well. And that goes for everything from fantasy to sci-fi, from close to reality to highly stylized. It's important to understand what you are designing for, not just being good at drawing pretty things. Not that that's not important, but as they say, many a sin can be covered by good sauce. But it's important that it's not just a heap of junk under there too.
Awesome sauce.
Yeah.
What about, I mean, I know, but I have to ask because, of course, it's relevant to the people, because you being the puzzle master of characters and everything also made you create your personal work in this great series of books of Time with one sketch per day. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that was more like a self-defense reflex. I was in a position where I wasn't really happy with where I was going and where my work was going, and sort of the professional aspect of my work brought me to a place I didn't want to be. And so a good place to escape is to indulge in escapism. And so I got this little challenge from a friend of mine to do kind of a character a day at the start of the year when he came to visit me. And that kept going for a while. And then I started to find ways to add to that, and that a lot of the stuff I did there was actually take the world building elements that my job consists of and apply them to something that kind of felt good to me, and that helped me kind of reassess myself and refine like what I thought was interesting. This had happened once before in a professional setting, and I'd kind of started losing a sense of my personal aesthetic or the stuff that I thought was cool. And when I saw that happening again, I didn't want to like have to go through a whole period of like finding myself again. So I started like, okay, I have to actively pursue it. I have to actively construct and create and define for myself what do I think is cool. And so that ability to kind of to build larger settings around individual elements and kind of extrapolate like a larger setting from the combination of smaller elements. That was really useful there. So I think that's where it started to really flourish as a hobby as much as a job.
And so basically, without your curiosity, this wouldn't have become reality at all. More like curiosity of yourself and who you are, right? Like,
yeah. So I think without curiosity, I would have probably never done art. If without curiosity, I would have probably become an engineer, because I do like engineering too, and I think I might very well have been a little more psychologically stable if I'd gone for engineering. So
well, that would be boring, wouldn't it?
Less surprises, more mandates. Yeah.
I cannot see you as an engineer. It's absolutely impossible.
Well, whether or not I would have been me is another question altogether.
Yeah. Okay. So, from all these clients that called you, you probably worked on some pretty exciting projects. Some of which we would like to know more about, of course. But most interesting is for you personally, as someone who is so personally invested also into what he's doing and who likes his job and who lives his job. Which one would you call the most interesting project of all these?
So the one that probably kind of invested in me this idea that world building and context building and understanding of source materials is super important. Probably working on Lord of the Rings Online. So when I was at Volta, we got that job, and I'm a huge Lord of the Rings nerd. Like, I know a lot of people say it, but fucking, if I have to gatekeep one thing in my life, it's fucking Tolkien. So I got really into it. I got really into like all the assignments we got. We were designing a lot of like Rohan things, and I love that part of the books. So I really got into it, and during kind of calls with the client, I knew more than they did. I didn't want to show that off, but I could use it to good effect to argue concept, and that was really useful. That the idea of being able to contribute more to the process than just being like a fancy image printer. That's kind of where concept art should be as a craft. It is, a lot of time when you work in concept art, what you get handed off is a very stringent brief with very specific kind of call outs to it, which doesn't allow for a lot of creative thinking. It's more like they've taken all the creative choices and they just want you to draw it pretty. And that's fine, but it's not necessarily good. And I found that like when concept artists are prompted to really kind of invest in a concept, in an idea, in a kind of a series of ideas that makes up a character, or at least kind of an element to design, you'll get more interesting things because it'll be a visual statement of an idea rather than like a pretty drawing representing an idea. And so that's definitely like what I learned most from working on Lord of the Rings Online was that thing of like I didn't always get my way, but understanding the source material, understanding like the motivation between different choices, that's powerful when it comes to concept art.
It kind of sounds like this was one of the first, like not probably like the first, but a really important step into becoming this nerd about believability or what the characters, right? The reason why it is so important or some substantial to you seems to have been manifested there for a significant part. Would you agree?
I think that's where I started probably developing that thinking. It was between that and meeting Nathan Fox, who also talks a lot about that kind of thing. He talks about it in terms of color treatment, but it really resonated with me, that thing of like you can go pretty crazy with colors, and it doesn't have to be realistic at all, but it'll still strike an audience as, okay, I'll buy into this. This seems like a place where I can imagine stuff happening. That's believability, and that's the power of that. Like if you've seen Prince of Egypt, for example, it's got crazy colors, but at some point your entire cynicism is alleviated, and you can just kind of live into the setting, that's the power of illusion.
Yeah. I mean, with all this in mind and the possible missteps, I mean, let's just ask straightforward, like, what could be, what would be something that someone that decides to study in that manner, since you already figured out like a big chunk of that. I would never say that you're done because I know you would hate that. But in a sense of you've gone a far way in this direction. Mm-hmm. What do people have to avoid in that direction? I mean, we know that you have to make mistakes to learn and everything, but which would be a path in realizing what a believable character is? What shouldn't you do? Which is misdirection in your opinion?
The first and foremost thing to do is to never start drawing as long as you have to describe your character with the succession of kinda, sort ofs. You hear this a lot. Like you get like a character sketch and it's got some cool things, but there's not that much carrying it together. And you ask the artist, like, who is this character? What is this? And it's like, that's kind of this thing and that thing, whatever. Which means they were trying to draw a cool archetype. They weren't trying to draw a character, and that's fine. But it's clear that they don't believe in the character. And so Disney said it very well. That first you have to believe it, then you have to then you have to design it, and then you have to give it life. And that's really important. Like, you have to work the character concept until it makes sense to you, so that you have something to express with it. And if you're not there yet, that's fine. Fucking keep throwing yourself at the problem. It's never gonna be like a ringing clock that says, like, now you are ready to draw characters. This is this is no science. This is an art. It is throw yourself at the problem until it starts making sense to you. It's like going to war, really. Having clear and set objectives and not getting stuck in the quagmire of half measures and poorly planned battle plans. That is huge. Realizing that art is a lot about planning, about taking it slow so that you can finish faster. Those things are very powerful to me. Like, it's one of the mantras I always follow is like, move slow to move fast. If you draw a lot, most of the time you spend drawing is spent fixing problems with your drawing because you made the mistake. So if you move slower, if you contemplate your moves, you're probably going to make fewer mistakes. You're probably going to have to correct fewer things. So it's probably going to take a shorter amount of time, even if you are more aware of the time it's taking. So in all that, what I'm saying is, like, there is no mysticism here. It is purely like a vocation, and it just needs to be approached that way. If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. We'll come back to the deeper meaning of that, but we've touched on it a little bit, so I'll just skip ahead. So for those of you in the audience who might not know what it is that I do, it might be worth showing a couple of things. These are a bunch of magic cards I did. I've been doing stuff for magic for 3 years now, 3.5 years. And I also work for a series of like video games and for Games Workshop, and I also do a lot of personal stuff. And as we've mentioned, overall, my general goal is believability, not realism. Realism dictates only, or is dictated purely by what is true in this world. But we very seldomly, especially if you're working in science fiction and or fantasy, are you making stuff for this world and this set of rules? So it's better to look to how we can convince an audience of the authenticity of our world than to play into that graveyard of theater called cynicism. Shakespeare said it very well, that, in the beginning of A Midsummer Night's Dream, that and I know that these are actors on a stage speaking lines in costume. But if you will indulge the illusion, we will make it as spectacular as we can. That's kind of the deal between illusion makers and audiences. So some very spectacular individuals who have worked this way is, for example, Paul Bonner, one of my favorite painters of all time. He's kind of the granddaddy of a lot of modern fantasy artwork. And right off the bat, you can see what I mean. Like, this isn't realistic, but it is deeply believable. I have no problem believing that this thing could move around and talk and like eat people. You know. Same for Paul Dainton, another fantastic artist who has done a lot of work for the Warhammer franchises of Games Workshop and Warhammer 40,000 too. And again, like, these creatures aren't realistic. However, the way he paints is deeply believable. It even borders on realism. So he's even better able to take like the outlandish stuff that is incorporated in those franchises he's been famous for working for, and like rendering them in a way where you and I can look at this and we can believe in the fiction of that world. And that's important. I mean, we can go deep into like how that has failed to affect like the further development of that franchise. But the point being here that as an audience to this, it's easy to look at these paintings and buy into the believability of this world, right? Same things on the slightly different slant is comics like Shaman Warrior and Blade of the Immortal.
Yay!
These two. The Blade of the Immortal is set in Japan during the Edo period, but it incorporates a lot of like fantasy elements and weird and natural things. But so this is an example of like playing up towards realism, but taking a sharp left turn when the question actually becomes relevant, which is an artistic choice. And I really like how Hiroaki Samura plays that off. It's quite interesting. If you haven't read it,
he managed to do this with this aspect of forgetting what happened in the past, basically, because this is believable because it looks like it could have happened, but nobody
exactly.
wrote it down.
It's like a Quentin Tarantino movie, you know, like a believable retake on history with comedy and everything. And of course, there's the kind of the third wheel of this, which is the massive black Noxus mad approach, which is like anything goes, just like throw weird shit out there, and if you can throw enough kind of believable elements on top of it, you can make it work. So Noxus mad, or Bruno Gore as his real name is very much the Tim Gunn of the concept art world. Like, throw anything at him and he can make it work. And it's a fiercely important tool to be aware of. This fact that you know, given a high enough skill level, you can make most things work. Most things, almost anything, can be rendered as cool, but it does very much need you to be the person who understands it and makes it into a statement of coolness. It's kind of like Andy Warhol and soup boxes, you know? Anyway, enough of believability. We're here to talk about character design. We're going to start with a little game, right? When you think about great characters, these tend to be built on a underlying structure we call an archetype. So we're going to play a little game, you and me. Starting with, I'm assuming you know this gentleman.
That's Captain Australia, right?
Yes, indeed. Captain Lone Star. Anyway, so... A for... anyway. So knowing what you know about this character, if you had to describe him without any of his personal specificities, like without him being Captain America, and without if you had to describe him purely on personality traits, what would you say about this guy? If you as succinctly as possible.
He's loyal. He's strong, and valor is probably his thing, but he's very protective. That's what I would say.
Very cool. Personally, thinking about this guy, actually, we'll come back to that. So I just want you to take on a couple of characters. We'll come back to them in a little bit, and I'll kind of do the reverse. But we have, the bride from Kill Bill.
Kill Bill.
Yeah. We have Han Solo from Star Wars. We have Christian Avasarala from The Expanse. Of course, my boy Aragorn, Elisar. Strong characters, I'm sure you would agree. So I want you to just give them all a think on the same level as we just did Captain America here. And we'll come back to them in a little bit. But I want you to think about them. I want you to kind of feel about them. What do you know about them? How would you describe them to someone else in the most shortly lived and succinct way possible. And the reason why I like to do this is, obviously, I really like characters a lot. It's not only my bread and butter, it's a bit of an obsession with me. And I really like breaking down characters to this idea of archetype, to this closed structures that allows me to get kind of a blueprint of understanding for a character so that I can build them up and explain that visually, right? So with each character, I do kind of do these personality deep dives and try to figure out like not just what they are, but who they are. So a great example here, I think, is Treebeard. I really like Treebeard as a character in the books, and I loved this picture I found of a New Orleans like jazz singer who was like striking that pose on stage, like singing, and I couldn't get the idea of that being Treebeard singing to the denizens of his forest, right? Like I thought that was a great take on that same kind of character, because this guy was clearly like the Treebeard of New Orleans. So I thought that was interesting. Or you have other more subtle characters, like Turin Turambar, and like trying to show some character elements in or personality elements in characters, and I think is important. So working with the pose, working with lighting, working with mood, working with detail, all these things are a way to talk about characters without talking about characters. And that's important. We don't really want to have a whole sort of dissertation to an audience about like why we like a character. We want to present a character in a way that automatically convinces an audience of the relative qualities of the character that we're giving them.
So in terms of, you said that you like to deconstruct characters and like to understand why they do what they do. Yeah. How much did you have to read up on psychology to make this possible? Because obviously this is what you're talking about is pretty much profiling, right?
That is true. I honestly have only read sparsely of psychology. I think it's super powerful. I think it's super useful. But psychology I'll try that again. Psychology is the systemization of personality information. And it's super useful, but it's not you don't need it, right? It's just that's common language between the people. It takes, though, an honest understanding of personality. And I do think that being a character designer kind of demands some empathy, because if you want to design for example, if you want to design a character like Sauron, for example, I don't think you can just do a big armored spiky dude. That doesn't feel like Sauron to me. Personally, I'm not I love Lord of the Rings movies, and I do think the depiction of Sauron there is pretty cool, but I really do not like how similar, for example, Sauron and the Witch King look. So I do feel like that there's like elements there where evil guys just get like a bunch of spikes and then it's evil.
Maybe it's their CI.
It's profiling.
Mordor CI. That's the brand.
Yeah, Jesus. But yeah, but I do think like as with, for example, Dali 100 years ago, he read a lot of Freud and he was fascinated by those theories. I think those theories over time have a lot of Freud, for example, has been discounted as an extremist view on something relatively benign. And I do think that there's there's a give and take in like going too deep into like written psychology of the time, but it's a good idea to stay updated on what psychological health is, and then having a baseload for understanding like why people make the choices they do, right? So, for example, with Dane Ironfoot down here, I really wanted to get that sense of him being a bit of a. I mean, you can kind of look in his face. He's like he's in the middle of a negotiation or something, leaning on his axe, and just like yeah, I hear you. However, like he's that kind of asshole. So that's the, especially in the books, right? Like when Gandalf tries to talk him down from the battle and stuff, he's like whatever, man, and it kind of just goes and does it anyway. So sometimes you can play that, but like with Gandalf over here, it was more like, okay, this is more like a character portrait of a character that we all have pretty complex understandings of. So I don't really want to do his as a really expository pose. I want to just kind of show off more of the costume with him. So I wanted to like play with the layering and like the different elements to kind of show how his his hobo-y costume kind of works, you know. So, but those are, you know, it can be easy to kind of go for a facet here, like a set of answers, and I don't think that exists. I think it's a bunch of choices, and you can dictate, or you can kind of answer to whether or not you think those choices are effective. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, all these characters tend to start the same way, or tended to. It starts with a blank page, and the blank page can be like the goddamn worst, right? Because if we just dive in, we talked about this a little earlier, but if you just dive in, it often ends up being this, right? It ends up being you fighting with the page, and sometimes you get a nice drawing out of it, but sometimes the page will win, and you'll lose your inspiration, and you'll be tired, and you'll be annoyed, and you won't feel like drawing. And so I would say that that's not necessarily a good place to start. I would say that where to begin is preparing for battle. As Sun Tzu said, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Or, if you want to be a little less militaristic about it, the 7 P's. And these are my go-tos. This is what I swear by. Prior planning and preparations prevents piss-poor performance. Lincoln even said it quite well, that if he had 10 hours to cut down a tree, he would spend 7 hours sharpening his axe. All of this just speaking to the strength and importance of preparing. So, pre-visualization, for example, is a strong goddamn tool, and it speaks to your ability as an artist to simplify the advanced tools that you're using to draw, to make a simulacrum of that effect in your mind. So that speaks to control, it speaks of premeditation, it speaks of the ability to take a step back and lay down a plan that you can be excited about, so that as you're working through your concept, you're not risking that terrible, terrible moment where you reach a point where you're no longer excited about your piece, right? That only ever happens, at least in my experience, it only ever happens when I haven't defined why this is an interesting piece to do, right? If I've done that ahead of time, if I've figured out why this is an important or interesting or fun piece to do, then I can go back to that later and say, like, all right, but I'm still excited about that, you know? So let's get planning then, right? And so in planning, as in any structured activity, we need some rules. Rule number 1, we always work general to specific, large problems into small problems. This is because the large problems will constrain the possibilities for the smaller. And that can sound negative. Constraints usually, especially in creative circles, tend to sound a little negative. However, in this case, it can be super useful. I'll use Photoshop as an example, right? When you first pick up Photoshop, you're like, I can do everything. I can do anything. I can do everything I want. But then you try and you like use every tool and it just looks like a hot mess. However, if you go about it a slightly different way and you put down some rules for yourself, you're saying, okay, I'm only going to work in like within this gamut. I'm only going to let myself like this amount of light settings, and I'm going to be structured in like how those are affecting the three-dimensionality of the object I'm trying to paint. Starting and defining your task via the restrictions on that task can actually help creativity and make it more of a statement, because as you are working with and against rule sets, you're actively making choices that affect the expression of the drawing or the thing that you're trying to say. In terms of world building, in terms of character, we need a world, right? We need the largest rule set around our character so we can start defining things down for the character. So what are the rules, right? What I mean here is, like, there are certain rule sets that differentiate the world of Mario from the world of The Witcher, that differentiate the world of Warcraft from the world of Westeros, right? We can talk about proximity to reality. We can talk about visual stylings. We can talk about the particular rules that govern the eating of mushrooms. All of these things seem to be very important for some settings over others. And so once we have dictated a certain set of rules that creates like a scaffolding, a framework for our world, then we can start moving down to the more specific sort of sets of rules. So the more specific to reality we get, the more specific the rules get, right? So specific to personal reality. So, once you've created the rules for your world, you create the rules for the elements for your region that you're working in, and what the political structure is there, and what the military structure is around there, what the cultural structure is around there. And, the more and more specific to the personal perspective we get, the more specific we get with the rule set. However,
how often do you have to go back because you got ahead of yourself of the whole thing? Because obviously, because if you proceed, you at some point will realize, oh yeah, I forgot to do this and that. And how do you keep track of that? Is it just a text document, or do you actually map out things with sketching connections and circles and like some conspiracy theorist?
No, I follow a mantra we will cut to a little later. The KISS rule. Keep it simple, stupid. So again, working from large problems to small problems, we can use archetypes, we can use specific setups, and we can talk to the intended value and or the intended result of a choice like that. So let's say that we're building a world where we have like an imperial culture, right? What I would say then is like you have essentially like 4 kinds of imperial structures in the world. You have like a trade empire, like with the English and the East India Company. You have a military empire like the Romans. You have a cultural empire like the Persians, and you have like a societal domineering empire like the Chinese. So you choose any one of those as an archetype, and you can break that down as a political statement as much as you want, and then apply that to your setting. You can also break down all of those political sort of complex systems and gain an understanding of it for yourself, and then construct a whole new one by your own basis, as long as the logic holds. And that's really the kind of the thorough red line here is logic. You have to establish a logic in the beginning that has to carry through to the end. Once that breaks, once you make one logical statement on one point and that doesn't carry over to the next one, that's when you start seeing the cracks in the build. So this is going to be very dependent on, a later point about like the proximity to reality. But just keep in mind how fucking pissed off people were when Raven suddenly flew too quickly in Game of Thrones. Like, that shit doesn't come from nowhere. Right? That's high proximity to reality stuff that suddenly starts getting thrown out of the window, and people are like, no, I know I didn't notice the airspeed velocity of ravens before, but the fact that you now obviously don't breaks the illusion, right? So my point is that overall I tend to keep this relatively simple with just like word sketching. So I like write down, the more general the problem solved, the more cursory my notes and my rules for it is, right? I'm trying to be like, the larger problems can be solved more simply, the smaller problems must be solved more specifically. So a very easy way to generate these choices is to ask questions, rather than like, nothing is harder than going and saying like, okay, I'm gonna come up with some rules. It's a little bit like sitting down and going, I'm just gonna draw something. That's almost impossible. So again, we gotta fucking trick ourselves a little bit, and that's where asking questions comes in. So I like to ask questions like, what does this culture have available to it, either reproduction, trade, or acquisition? What do they emphasize? What level of technology, and how egalitarian is the spread of that technology? These are important cultural kind of statements, and this will also go back to kind of touching on like the larger themes of that culture, right? Their aesthetic basis. And all of these things can be pretty hard. These are particular questions that I use, and it can be, and they speak to like layers of information for me. I think the more you get into this, the more specific your own questions becomes to like your own emphases for character designs. But these are important to me because they speak to like how I feel like designing my characters, you know. So the questions you ask will, to a certain degree, dictate or at least affect the way you design your characters later. So think about the questions. But from these questions and from this general idea of the closer we get to the visual impression of the audience, the more we need to stipulate, the more we need to kind of evoke and generate that illusion. So the more specific to reality we get, the more stipulation we need to do in the design, right? Everyone knows what an axe looks like, so maybe don't make an axe with a pointed end, The Hobbit. I'm sorry, but that still sticks with me. That's not an axe, that's a mattock, and it's mounted the wrong way. Anyway, it's easy to think about it like this. I like this chart a lot. It really kind of affects the way I think about my design work a lot. So abstract reality in this case symbolizes something of a rudimentary representational system. So anything from like an indie game to a 16-bit like Game Boy game. Think Link to the Past, right? That sort of thing. The representation in the game, I mean, you'll know this if you've been a gamer for a couple of years, right? The more abstract the graphics get, the more you as audience have to kind of turn off your skepticism and kind of just buy into it, right? It's the only way to kind of enjoy it. Otherwise, you're just kind of sitting there going like, what's this pixel? You know?
That's why cartoons work so well.
Yeah, exactly. So you can then say, like, the more abstraction, the more you have the willingness of the audience to suspend their disbelief to give you the benefit of the doubt. That's very important to be aware of as we start moving closer to reality, right? So abstract reality is dictated by the abstraction, therefore the audience is willing to suspend disbelief. They're willing to not be cynical about what they're seeing, right? Their believability filter is lowered. As we move into stylized reality tending to be a sort of artist's expression of the world through a certain filter, the audience is going to want to see more. They're going to want to see more of an explanation of a element of the real world through your stylization. And therefore, their willingness to suspend disbelief is somewhat less. Their believability filter is kind of on half cock, if you will. And then from here on down, we start dancing dangerously close to uncanny valley country. Proximate reality is, AAA games. It's up there on TV series and stuff like that. The illusion needs to be very strong for that stuff to stick. And ironically, the more the audience gets used to that kind of visual representation, the more picky they get. And especially after landmark moments like the Lord of the Rings movies, for example. If you look at fantasy movies before, like in the 90s and 80s, I mean, Conan the Barbarian, for all that it is, does not look like it was produced by anyone more elaborate than, say, a mid-tier LARP community. It's not a huge sort of triumph production-wise. I'm not saying I'm not a fan. I'm just saying, things have gotten better. Times are better. Same thing with Game of Thrones, right? Like before Game of Thrones came, you'd be like, it's a fantasy TV series. You can't expect that much. And now that we've all seen it, we're like, okay, we got to step shit up. So the
Remember
thing
Xena.
is, yeah, exactly. So when something like that comes up, the general audience is now going to be less willing to suspend disbelief. They're going to expect a lot more. And being aware of that balancing act can be a good motivator to put a lot of thought into your designs, especially the stuff that hits close to home with people. They're going to be more choosy. So you have to become the expert. You have to become the person. Like the next time I see a fantasy series that pours molten metal into a sword sort of form to make a sword, I will be very annoyed because that is not how you make a sword. And I know that most of the time they do it as a call out to the old Conan movie, but that was a mistake in the original medium.
Yeah, but it looks so.
No, it doesn't.
Cool.
It looks so dumb. Especially if you've seen the actual forging of an actual sword, that shit looks so much more badass. Of course, it's more of a production, but it looks better. And
but you have this dark room.
No, I don't.
People standing around the sword.
I do not accept your premise of glorious mediocrity here. No, sir. No. It's like modern Greek showing up in an ancient Greek setting. I know that shit triggers you. I'm just saying, same thing.
But listen, so if you're talking about an abstract reality, and you say the production and the believability of Conan the Barbarian was LARPish, why don't we just believe that the metal could be poured?
No, I'm saying if Conan the Barbarian was a 16 or 32-bit video game, and they wanted to show that they cast swords in molds, I've no problem with that if it's that abstract, right? Then it doesn't matter. Except for the fact that it is a system and a thing that we do understand as people, and it should just be clear that you don't forge swords. It's not even a thing. Anyway, anywho, yeah, I'm just against cliches like that. But then again, I'm a hypocrite because I use cliches too. Anyway, we can't get hung up on this. My point is simple. That the closer we work towards a reality, the closer we work to the real world, the more we need to be willing to step up, do research, and stipulate. That means express in the design. That being scene design or concept design or context design, whatever it is. Become the expert. And now that we've made all these goddamn choices, we have a world, for lack of a better. We have a culture. And it's very tempting to get drawing. But patience! Because we have something we haven't talked about yet, and we've come full circle, my friend. We've been talking about context, but now we're going to be talking about concept. Ta-da! Hell yes. We're going to be finding that heart of that character, and we're going to bring back your old friend, Captain America. So, you had some ideas about him. And I do remember strength and vigilance being part of it, so that sounds a lot like a paladin to me. Yes, indeed. I think his archetype is definitely the paladin struggling with pragmatism, right? He is from a time where life and the world was more black and white. Hitler was bad. America was good. Black and white. I mean, that's... Yeah, anyway. And now that he's been transported to the present day where everything's a little more gray... He's struggling with that. That is a large part of his character development throughout the series. And it's a pretty good breakdown of him as a character. You could transpose this into other settings and get interesting characters out of it because it's an interesting character setting. Same thing with The Bride. What?
Question for Captain America. So,
yes.
Do you believe this, just a little bit nerding out, do you believe this has to do with the fact that he came from a simpler time, or because his role was simpler?
Because his role was simpler. Well, why
he was just a soldier.
Why do you think his role was simpler?
Because he was a soldier.
No, because, and that's exactly the point. It was a time when being a soldier was a simpler thing because it was a simpler time. Because the idea of being a soldier was, in American senses, the idea of serving the homeland and going off and fighting wars. And now it is somewhat more politically charged and societally vulnerable of a role, and especially since people are talking about like the defunding the police system, and the idea of American security has for the last I'm not going to get into a whole fucking political diatribe. Yes, I do believe that in the 40s, the general idea of what it was to be a paladin, what it was to be a hero, what it was to be whatever it was the basis for them to build Captain America as an archetype on, was more black and white. And I think if you look at early Captain America, it is him running around beating the shit out of Hitler and stuff. It wasn't super fucking impressive. And so the modernization of Captain America, I'm not a huge fan of Marvel movies for the most part, but I think he is a great character because they took that and they ran with it, right? They took the idea of a character who didn't quite understand all the kind of nuances, even though he is righteous in like the most specific sense of that word. However, his understanding of the finer points of like societal struggle in the time where he's been gone is not present. So he is struggling with that, and that struggle makes him compelling as a character. But to answer your question specifically, yes, I do believe he comes from a quote unquote simpler time.
Okay. The Bride.
Yes, the Bride. So again, what would you say as like the archetypical for her?
Well, she's basically Mrs. Vengeance, I would say.
Very cool, very cool. I like it. She is, in my case, the warrior, right? The archetype of the warrior, driven by vengeance. I would say that she's the warrior because among a group of assassins that are the most deadly in the world, she is by far the deadliest. And they're all like, they all make a whole plot point about her being the Black Mamba, and that's like the most dangerous thing in the world. So she's obviously like the most dangerous. Yeah. So yeah, exactly, the warrior driven by vengeance. It's a classic setup, and of course, context plays in here. I do want to, especially on the warrior point, the fact that she's wearing the Bruce Lee suit, and he is literally like the Deus image of a warrior. It's like it's pretty clear. Han Solo. I mean, we can start going through this a little quicker, but yeah, what do you say?
I would say he's basically kind of, I don't know. He's kind of complex. I would say he's like a funny character, but at the same time he has like a good core, probably, But it's driven by profit, so it's kind of someone with weird moral values, probably, who's still finding himself.
Yeah, I'd say he's the rogue with the heart of gold.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. Again, that's a very simple statement, and you can say this about other characters too. But knowing that is the core of his character not only explains him very well, it also lets you understand on like a personal level, especially what you said about like his moral code being a little complex. It makes you understand like the actual catharsis of the moments when he does good, right? We have Christian Avasarala.
Oh my god!
Have you've seen The Expanse, I guess?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the character is just brilliant, and the character development along the series is also brilliant. I think it's hard to describe her because she's a politician that basically thinks she's doing good for everybody, but has to do some tough decisions. That's basically a politician in general. Ice Queen questing for the truth. Yeah.
Right. Because as she, like, our struggle as viewers with Avasarala is that our first view of her is the Ice Queen. She is the distant. She is, the imperious individual. And then the thing that redeems her is that she is on this almost blind quest for. She does not care what's in the way of her finding out. She will find out what's been going on, and she will figure out, like, what's the truth, cost what it may. And it costs her everything. Again, a basis of a character, informing her struggles, making them compelling. And of course...
And it's funny because you never really know if you side with her or not, because some of her motives not always seem to be driven by wanting to find the truth, but also, like maybe some personal stuff, I would say.
Oh yeah, no, so the way she acts isn't about giving other people the truth. No, she is not the mouthpiece for Veritas at all. She's very okay with lying to other people, but she must know. Right? Every time there is something that gets between her and truth, she will kick and scream and bite until she gets it. I mean, she literally gets in the line of fire just to find out the thing. I can't spoil.
Yeah.
And of course, Aragorn, the big A, the big E. What would you say?
He's the exile with a huge low self-esteem issue.
That's a good way of thinking about it. I don't think it has to do with self-esteem. I think it's the archetype of the king, which is in denial of his destiny, right? It's not so much. I mean, I don't know. This is about different ways of reading it, but I always feel like he is trapped between like the perpetual teenager who just doesn't really want to do the thing, and also this angst. I mean, he is an 83-year-old teenager. He's got angst about his ability to do this thing that he's destined to do. So it's kind of but Orwin, I don't want to be a king. I'll probably be bad at it anyway. Oh, go. So the point here being that finding these core points of a character will never let that character be boring for you. And so using this, we can try and find the heart of our own character as a part of process to build them in a way where they will be compelling to us, so that by the time we sit down to draw them, we are not looking for a task to do. We are looking for a way to solve a problem that we have now defined for ourselves. And trust me when I say, that is about 1 billion times easier. So, seeing as I like to keep things even easier than that, I would say that in terms of drawing something, I want a simple mandate for myself, right? I want to express myself simply. So if I was to draw these guys, I would give myself a simple core word for them. I would use pride for Captain America. Not because he is overly prideful all the time, or that is overly central, but because that is his expression, right? Same with the bride. She's about guts more than anything else. She's nothing left to lose, and she just goes in there. With Han Solo, it's bravado. It's this sort of illusion of control, even if when he is absolutely not in control. With Avasarala, I would say it is about control. It is about her controlling every situation, always playing people off each other, always trying to control people, which is eventually what gets her in trouble. And for Aragorn, it's leadership. The interesting thing about Aragorn is that when he's not hanging around Rivendell being a mopey teenager at the tender age of 85, he can't help but be the king, right? Every time he goes abroad with Elisar and Elrohir, or when he goes to Rohan to help Theoden in his youth, he can't help it. He becomes like an accidental general. And so his destiny manifests through his unpremeditated actions, which is a pretty fun thing. Mm-hmm. Right? Yep. And so, just for a little sort of sidestep, a little tangent before we go on, we have to talk about studies, references, and internalization. This is both one of my favorite and least favorite things to talk about, because studying in upon itself became to me like a huge energy drain for a long time. I really didn't like the idea of having to sit down and do studies, and I for a long time didn't really feel like I got a lot out of it. I felt like, oh, okay, I've done another nice landscape thing, but I still don't know how to do landscapes. That sort of thing. And I feel like, I'm not sure that this works for everybody, but for me, studying changed a lot when I changed that attitude, right? When I started going into doing studies with the attitude that I was solving a specific problem, again, taking that out of the sort of sketch approach, that became a lot easier. So studying needs to be done with a specific goal in mind. So breaking down and analyzing the disciplines in how the different disciplines of anatomy or light or material, composition or color or whatever that you're trying to understand. If you simplify your study to only encapsulate one or two or whatever set number of these qualities that you want in the reference, and you just extrapolate that. So let's say that you're doing an anatomy study. For God's sake, don't start doing lighting. For God's sake, don't start doing colors or composition. None of that is important if you're studying anatomy. If you're studying anatomy, study anatomy. That means, even in upon anatomy, there's a further breakdown. Studying all of human anatomy, for example, at the same time is almost impossible. So you have to start with like the core elements. Start with the head, get an understanding of how to rotate and compose it. Get the torso and its interaction with the extraneous limbs, and then start putting those together to draw a functioning human kind of model. Then start introducing more subtle things like gesture and movement and acting, right? This is a long drawn out process, and people tend to do like a couple of quick little anatomy studies and they go like, fuck it, I know anatomy. And then they get into like a difficult drawing and they're like, man, this is impossible. And I'm literally quoting myself here from when I was doing that. And then you get frustrated and you're like, is some vague reason for why this isn't entirely my fault and yada yada. You have to approach studying and art in general with the attitude that this is gonna be hard.
You know the meme with what was it? It's not wrong anatomy, but it's my style or something.
Oh yeah, the deviant
this is
artifacts
going around. Yeah, I don't know. This is going around as a meme all the time. Like everybody's saying, like, "Oh yeah, but it's my style."
Yeah, there's another meme which I really like, which is like a cartoony person who's sitting down and is like, how do I learn to draw better? And then there's someone who just puts like paper and pen in front of them and just like pushes them towards it. Just
the head like
There's a lot of people I hear from say like, I've been studying and I'm not getting anything out of it. And then the same test can be done with studies as it can be done with sketches, as we talked about before. When I then ask them, what were they studying? They'll be like, kinda, sorta. And I'm like, that's the problem.
Since we're talking about believability of characters, and since we're talking about studying, what would you say if people want to study characters, not only in drawing, but also in creating believable characters, their brains, everything that makes their personality? What kind of books should people look out for because obviously to find references, you have to know a lot of characters and then use their bricks and put them together. What would you say? What is good books to study to figure out?
Well, I think so I'm not going to give a book list because that would be a list of books that
just
I like,
in general,
right?
Like
so and then the kind of obvious reply is, well, books with great characters. And that also seems a little fucking unuseful. So what I will say is, I think the core study of a character designer is people, right? And so read whatever it is that fascinates you and that has to do with people, right? Let yourself be fascinated by people. Don't look for heroes. Look for interest. Look for stuff that actually resonates with you. And when you find that, you will find that drawing stuff inspired by that is no longer a pursuit of drawing a drawing that measures up to other people, but it is the pursuit of explaining to other people why this thing that you think is cool is cool. I cannot overstate that point. It is so fucking important. It's the same thing we talked about before with Disney. You have to believe it first. If you believe it and you understand it, you can make it cool. We're actually coming to that point just now. But that is so important. So if you are fascinated by something, that's good. Let that fascination be the fuel that drives you to understand something. Once you've understood something, or at least gained enough of an understanding to make a statement about that thing, then you're ready to draw it. The end product you're looking for when it comes to studying is to internalize. You want to be able to, via your own rule set and your own understanding, you want to be able to show and be able to reproduce from your own kind of visual library or mental library the things that you have studied, right? That's the end goal. That's how you draw from your head. So you can exchange the word study as of from right now to figuring stuff out is a much better expression. And it also tells you like what you're supposed to be doing. Don't make copies. Figure shit out. That's what we're doing. So, taking a look at some studies and stuff. Like, it's important to not be overly concerned with like direct accuracy or with prettiness. Like, the only point for each of these studies is to figure a single thing out, right? The armor studies are for the relevant distributional material in armor and how it sits on each other and where you would place rivets and understanding how that construction works. The naked lady on the top right is light on stone, right? The bottom right one is what what does the surface texturing on a fighter jet actually look like? On the one next to it, it is like the surface treatment on a car. All these things are important in upon themselves, and by making a simplified process by which to achieve that same look, you can gain an understanding of how to do that in a piece that you have constructed yourself. So study for a simplified understanding that you can reproduce. Study for understanding. Study for figuring stuff out. Now, just to simplify, deconstruct. I'll try that again. The modus by which you most effectively do that is deconstruction, analysis, reconstruction, and application. Meaning, as you see a piece of reference, what I want you to be doing is to look at that reference and ask yourself, what is the information I'm trying to get out of it, right? Narrow down the amount of work you want to be doing. Then, once you've done that, you analyze. You figure out what is this, what is happening within this discipline in this piece. Reconstruction is a direct study based on your already existing observations. This is important because it's more than just copying what you're seeing. It's taking your understanding and trying to put that down on paper, informed by the reference. And then application. This is the most important of all. When you've done a bunch of studies, apply them, right? If you study a bunch of birds, immediately go draw a bunch of birds. If you're studying plants, immediately go draw a bunch of plants. If you're studying color, immediately go and do some color sketching afterwards. It's important. It's how you lock it into the brain. It is physical. It's how you create those like little bridges in the brain between thought patterns and whatnots. And it brings us to this rule number 3, which is my favorite rule. Because my great enemy in the world, apart from all the other things, is the rule of cool.
Oh, okay.
The rule of cool sucks. Because cool in that sense is used as a mask against understanding. And so you just throw cliches around until everybody nods out of fear. And I don't like it. It's boring. So, when we design, we should design from understanding. So that if you understand something, you can try and communicate that understanding to someone else. And that is cool. So do that. And once you are there, once you know what you're trying to say with the drawing that you want to make, then we draw. Right, brothers. So, on that note, gonna have to switch gears a little bit because gonna have to try to show you, don't we? So, here are a couple of examples of how I do the things that I do. This is Paul Atreides. For those of you who are fans and or at least familiar with the Dune universe, Paul is like the Messiah, but a little cooler. So the way he's got skizzles. The way he is described in the books, he is, he's trained to be paranoid. He's always slightly concerned, and he exists in this culture of sort of interplanetary feudalism, where the kind of theatrics that goes on between the noble houses of the setting are almost farcical. It is pretty great as a setting, and so my attempt at designing a costume for that wanted to play up against the same idea of kind of medieval showmanship as was back in our own day. So the couple of things I could pick up from the text were the bullfighting, which Paul's grandfather died doing. There's a lot of sort of spoken and thought references to kind of samurai culture and this duty-bound service element. So there's an element of that. There's again that feudal part, so capes and uniforms becoming part of the costume was important. And also trying to tie in elements like, instead of just giving him straight up pants, giving him some hose, for example. I thought, would be a nice way. So talking you through the general costume, Paul comes from a planet called Caladan, and he lives now on a planet called Arrakis. Caladan is very verdant and full of water and whatnot, and Arrakis is a desert. So I wanted to show how, there's a sense in the book that they're ill at ease and not really fitting in. and I wanted to show that. So it's Paul in his kind of very green and kind of richly inspired Caladan costume, but then he's starting to be influenced by the desert, so there's like dirt in his boots and whatnot. So breaking down the overall design, we'll go deeper into it as we kind of break down the design, but it's just important to kind of note out that I tried to break it down into like 3 families of color. So you have the turquoise and green that form up the center, and they are the green and blue of Caladan. Then the red is the red of the Atreides, and then the black, I wanted to make it look like kind of modern kind of polymers or plasticky kind of stuff to represent like the age and the contrast between the feudal parts and kind of the space age parts. Mm-hmm. So as we start out, you have to start solving the large problems. Those large problems are pose, gesture, expression. And we can use these to contrast or complement the primary read. The primary read I wanted for Paul was to express this paranoia, this idea that you should never sit with your back to a door. Like that's a central tenet in the beginning of the book. And there's a lot of stuff like that. So I'm giving him a pose where he's standing very straight up and down, looking off to the side, and he's got a dagger in his backhand there, like ready to stab anybody who comes at him. So the paranoia is there, but he's also they're theatrically understated, these characters. So it needs to be restrained. It needs to be small movements, but in a static silhouette, that sort of thing. So that takes us through the gesture and pose. Expression in general is supposed to kind of again get that slightly worried, slightly anticipatory facial expression. You be the judge of how well that worked. Next is color, and that is a weakness of mine. I'm not particularly good at colors, and I don't really do a lot more fancy stuff than like comparative contrast work. I'm not saying that I'm bad. I'm just saying like there are a lot of people who have a lot more interesting takes on color than I. But so I essentially,
There's always a bigger fish.
Yeah, that's true. But so I take my cues a little bit from Oscar Wilde, who, when asked what his favorite color was, he said he did not prefer one color over the next. It was the harmonies between them that mattered, and I agree with that. So I I try to create sort of balance or imbalance in the relationship between colors to kind of emulate the same emotional reaction as I had to a character. So if I want that character to be ugly, I want to match that with giving them some ugly colors. Or if there's someone who is beautiful but isn't like an ugly personality, I might want to like fuck around with their color scheming on that. Make it subtle. So again, I talked about the colors earlier, but as you can see, the flat colors here are very simple. The way I work is I try to break down like all my different sort of specific disciplines. So in this case, I've broken it down to color, shading, light, and rendering. So in coloring, I work just flat colors. I imagine here the colors unaffected by anything but the most general 50% non-specific lighting, knowing that I'm going to both be adding and removing value. So it's I want room to be working up and down on the value scale, essentially. We've talked by the color before. I also want to note that like I plan ahead here. So again, those 7 Ps are coming in handy. But so I'm planning both up and down a little bit. So I'm adding texture, for example, on his jacket, and I'm building towards those places where I want more attention. I want, you can see that the largest amounts of vibrance on this guy is up towards the mantle and up in the face, and that is by design, so that that's where your mind and your eye is attracted to, like in the end, and that's important. I want you to feel like looking at his face. Shading, it's important to be aware of, if not overly exploitative of, the power of shadow shapes to be kind of pointing elements. So you can see like the big shadow shapes in his cape are helping to give avenues for the eye to rise up the central form. The cast shadow on his right leg, the left leg in this composition, has a couple of shadow shapes that drives the eye, or at least gives avenues for the eye to travel upwards. And then there's a lot of sharp and edged shadows in his face to attract attention to there. There's even like the cast shadow that goes under his cheek is non-accurate, but I wanted to frame his face a lot more to kind of really pull it out. Then for adding lights, here's a good possibility of adding general sort of drama, or at least managing your values. So I knew that I wanted a few light callouts on his face, around his body. I didn't want too much. So you can see that I'm using these. I'm using the light the same way I've been using the shadow to attract attention up around the face and up around the mantle. That's where the most detail is, and that's where I want you to be looking. And then it's render time. And for me, rendering really comes down to choices again, right? Like if I've been supporting the same choice throughout the process, then the rendering is just about cleaning stuff up and making it pretty. So half of my rendering time is used on removing line work that I'm no longer interested in. And removing line work is often the step between this being a colored drawing and what reads as a painting. And then a little bit of smudging on top of that can make it look all nice and clean. So not a whole lot of difference between these two. But you can say there's a little bit of texturing, a little bit of cleaning up. There's a little bit more of like turning shapes and turning edges.
Mm.
And so that's
about render techniques. Are they? I mean, every artist probably not every artist, but I mean there are groups of artists who do things very differently. Like just look at Ranja. But what I mean is, do you have any since? How can I say, since your quick approaches of characters look always already very, very much like splash art and can also be used aside from being concepts themselves, also being used for promotion and marketing because they are just so elaborately well done. Would you say there are any specific techniques that can be learned to speed this process up, to create great visuals just from concepts?
That's a really hard question. Of course, like there are basics. For example, dramatic lighting would automatically increase interest. But it will also increase drama, and that's not necessarily what you want for a character, right? So I would say that part of the reason why my stuff works as kind of more marketing-y and more cinematic-y stuff is that there's a pretty clear message that I tend to support with like multiple arrays of detailing and levels of kind of information. And so it reads simply. Other than that, it's kind of adding further layers of theatricality to support the same point. I think also managing detail is super important. So like if you detail everything all the time, it's just going to seem noisy. If you manage your detailing and simplify other things, it'll make that detailing stand out even more, and it will aid with the feeling of something feeling finished.
Would you say there are? I mean, you always say for anatomy and studying and everything, look to Loomis. But if you would look at other artists, and if you say like this is a really cool render technique, can you drop some names like who to look at, who to emulate?
Sure. I mean, there's Paul Bonner has a really nice sort of. He almost always relies on implied cool lighting, and so his points of high pressure between objects like wrinkles and stuff, instead of imagining a shadow there, he'll envision a shadow that ends in a pretty stark highlight. So if you just go over Paul Bonner things, you'll see that he calls out, instead of going with darkest darks, he'll call out like the depths of these kinds of things with a stringent highlight instead, which is a clever little take. It's like if you stand at just the right angle and you can see like in a crevice or something, the lowest part of the crevice will have the same visual value as something that's closer to you because they're at the same angle to your face. Like stuff like that is quite interesting. I would say Noxus Mad, Bruno Gore, has an excellent render style where everything is worked mostly in normal layers and collapsed all the time, and he actively destroys detail so as to manage it towards the point he wants it. I'll probably see that Callum Alexander Watts has one of the best managed styles I know. It's kind of very strictly managed, simple layers of information put on top of each other to create these like almost surgical looking pieces. It's pretty impressive. And then there's the genius of 3D, like You have people like Yami Urabayev, for example, who creates very effective images, and even though he has all the detail in the world at his fingertips, he still manages to kind of curate that stuff down so that it's interesting, and I think that's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many ways of answering that question, and I don't know how pertinent it is, because these are trends that change over time. Like 10 years ago, nothing was hotter than Brad Rigney, and now a bunch of people are painting in very much the same way, and it's more of an understood style. And so like the wow factor is gone a little bit, and now it's like it's very good craft, but it's not as wow as it was before. We've seen behind the curtains, so there's there's a lot of that stuff too.
That's the reason why I'm asking, because in the way that you describe it, basically it can be something that is distracting too much. So probably as soon as you don't put too much attention onto a phase like the rendering phase, maybe your character improves from that, because it just means that you have more time to spend on other things. That's a very good point. I would say, in the same way that I've been delaying the pleasure of starting to draw anything at this point, delay rendering. Realize that most of what we call rendering tends to be cleaning shit up, and so go back in your layers first and clean them. Make sure that they are to the point, that you are getting what you want out of them, and that that information, that layering information, is done clearly and susceptibly. Like, if you can get that down, then the world is your oyster. So I would definitely say, like, more time spent on deliberate choices and deliberate execution is probably time better spent than just getting into the render layer. A lot of, I mean, we've been running the assignment thing on the Patreon for a while now, and a lot of the problem people run into, especially late stage, is that they finally get to the render stage, and then they realize that they've taken such great steps on other fronts that the rendering is no longer really like where they can save themselves, because they're kind of moved past that just noodle till you're done stage, and the more information they add, the weaker the piece actually becomes. And so I do want to go take you through like one more example that's a little more advanced. It's this guy. So this is the headmaster for a kind of Harry Potter style magic school in Scandinavia that I came up with after being annoyed that we didn't have one. And yada yada yada, Durmstrang, yada yada. They didn't have longships. They're not from Scandinavia. Boom. Moving on. Same kind of procedure in the beginning. Here with the line art and everything, kind of going through the same thing, trying to figure out kind of how this character should feel, what's important about this character. This being character that I came up with myself is somewhat of a different approach than someone that's defined by an already existing thing, because I have to make him up as I go along. So the idea here was to kind of bounce it off of archetypes generated from the original Harry Potter series. So this guy, being the headmaster, would have to be something to relate to or to contrast against Dumbledore. And I didn't think, and so like this guy would have to be the anti-Dumbledore. So he's like he's an amalgam of Thor and Odin, and he's just like grumpy and mad all the time. And I think that must have to do with the fact that he did brave but diligent service in the Troll Wars, and he's been plagued with visions and trolldom ever since. And then a couple of stages of taking simple steps to minimize effort, essentially. So, for example, the old Photoshop trick of slapping a silhouette beneath your line art so that you can start adding information cleanly. Didn't want to do a lot of background work here, so I just slapped something together, and then we went on with some local color. A lot of the same approach as with the Atreides thing here. I do actually think they more or less share the majority of their color scheme, which is a little embarrassing. But same kind of thing here. I'm trying to take the points of highest contrast and interest and put them up around the face, and then kind of disperse it across the rest of the character to kind of give you points to look to, essentially. Then
dealing with light, I do that separately so that I don't have to think about how the light is affecting the colors. I just want to get the light right. So I'm doing this with a multiplayer layer and using the rules of simultaneous contrast. I know that if I add warm shadows, the light will seem cooler. The combination of these two generates a nice simulacrum of what the final piece will be. So I can, in a production situation, send this off to a client and get an idea of whether or not I'm moving in the right direction. And then we start pushing and pulling, right? First step is to add a little bit of value, start rounding out the character. I mean that physically, like every surface that's rounding away from me gets a little hit of value because I want to generate the idea that, you know, higher value is more towards me, at least in this lighting situation. Then adding a little bit of highlighting using a linear dodge layer with a dark blue value. Again, building that like dark, the cold light visual. And then when I have that information, I can start jabbing it together. So this breaks a little bit with what we just said about like hold off on rendering. I would say that that this process is antiquated at this point. I would probably in a modern version have gone back and calculated for this in the previous stages and then wrapped it together, which would have taken 5 to 6 hours less. It's a lot of work in rendering here. Then I took some time away from it. You had to think it over, mull it over, see how I was feeling when I came back to it, and I saw a couple of things. One, that staff is looking like a tumor and has to go. Secondly, it didn't really look very sort of Viking-y, so I thought, why not a raven? That seems appropriate. And he had to get a little darker because he was getting too jolly, just too happy. So a little bit of darkness and also a dark crystal because we had seen the dark crystal. And I am nothing if not a slave to impressions. So, you know, dark crystal, little bit of sort of environmental lighting to start setting him into the background. And finally, if you've been paying attention, you'll see that hand has just descended into nothingness. So finally we fix that. And then we start adding the fancies. So right, once I have everything else done, that's when I start adding the special effects. So we can use that to kind of add some dramatic lighting up towards the face, and then we can add some dramatic top light to like frame out the character.
Yeah.
And then smudging out the edges to kind of stop the eye from like being attracted down to those sharp edges. And that's pretty much it. That is yeah.